when everybody knows you in your hometown and it's a small town and you've been there since you were a kid, they really know you, don't they? They know stuff about you that you wish they'd forget, but they don't. They might have forgotten some of the good things, but they've not forgotten any of the bad things. It's just the way people have always been. You know, it reminds me of growing up in school, starting with a group of kids when we were first grade, 5 and 6 years old, and going through school with them. Here's what I noticed. By the end of first grade, or maybe halfway through the second grade year, everybody had pretty well been categorized. You were in the cute category, the ugly category, the smart category, the dumb category. You were fast or you were slowpoke. You could catch or you were clumsy. And these categories that we got stuck into, whether we really wanted to or not, had a way of sticking. And so it was with the woman at the well. She got off to an embarrassing start early in life, but it didn't start out looking bad or feeling like a mistake. I mean, most people who really make the big mistakes in life don't do so because they're asking, okay, God, show me, what could I do? Who could I marry? What decisions could I make that could completely ruin my life for the next 50 years? We don't do that. And yet it happens. And it happened to the woman at the well. As a young girl, she met this boy who said all the right things. And he looked into her eyes and just lit her up. Her mother and father liked him too. They arranged a wedding, and it was the happiest day of her life. But after that, it was only downhill, because that marriage did not work. And in that world, if a man got tired of his wife, he just wrote a paper. He didn't even need an attorney. He just wrote a paper stating that he was divorcing her and giving a reason, most any reason, and presenting it to the priest. And she was on the street. He was free to marry again, which helps you understand why Jesus said divorcing a woman made her into an adulteress, because she married again the second time and the third time, the fourth time, even the fifth time. And things just got worse each time. Thank God it's not always that way. Thank God. I'm impressed to see that some of the healthiest, happiest marriages I've ever seen are second and third marriages. You know who those people are? It's the people who got it wrong the first time or two, but they learned something. They learned something about life, about the opposite sex. They learned something about themselves, and they made some changes. And so when they entered marriage the next time, they did not enter marriage as the same person they had been. You see, without that kind of transformation, if we don't really learn from our mistakes and change whatever it was about us, take an honest look and figure out, what was it that I was doing, thinking? What was it about the way I looked at stuff that set me up for that trouble? If you can do that, difficult work, painful work of looking at yourself in the mirror honestly and not holding your stomach in, but just seeing what's there and what needs work, that is when you begin to grow and change. And as you become a better human being, a better Christian, a happier person, a healthier person, guess what you attract? Other healthy people, other happy people. Like attracts like. So if you want to attract people who are different than all the others in the past, you need to become different from what you were in the past. This woman may have tried to do that, but she had nobody to teach her. Nobody took any time. A woman like her was not allowed to sit in the synagogue and study with the men, so she didn't know much about the scripture or how God worked. All of her associations with men had turned out to be big disappointments until she met this one man who knew things about her that she didn't even know about herself, who knew her better than she knew herself, but also he loved her way more than any man or woman ever had. In fact, this may have been the very first man who ever really loved her. And in the presence of this one man who just loved her, he didn't want anything from her. He wasn't asking for anything. He wasn't expecting anything. He just wanted to give her what he had. That's really all of us. That's really all that any of us can give other people. We can give others what we have. And I'm speaking, that really applies everywhere, in every area of life. But let's say in your Christianity, you can only give others what you yourself have. Whatever kind of relationship with God you have, that's the only thing you can model for other people. The things that God has taught you, the ways that He has developed and matured you, that's what you have to give, to share with other people. And so the more teachable I am, the more humble I get, the more I receive, and the more I have to give. Jesus gave her something nobody had ever given her. You know what that was? Unconditional acceptance. He just took an interest in her immediately. This woman who had nothing to offer him that he could have possibly wanted. And he said to her, "Why don't you go call your husband?" And she said, "Sorry, sir, I don't have a husband." "Right," he said. "You don't have a husband. In fact, truth is you've had 5 husbands, and the man you're living with right now is not your husband. You really told me the truth there." I don't know that that's what she was expecting. I don't know that that's what she was wanting to hear, but Jesus made it plain. He knew her story, backward and forward. None of the folks in town, none of the gossips back in town knew her story as well as Jesus did. But Jesus looked on her story. He looks on your story with a completely different set of eyes. When Jesus looks at her story, your story, my story, He doesn't nitpick around and see what all He can find to criticize in our past decisions. He looks for opportunities, for places where He can rebuild something that was destroyed. He looks for things that have worn out and run down, that we've just sort of given up on. And He begins to show us that with Him, none of our experiences, not even our bad experiences are truly wasted. Is there anybody here feeling as though a large segment of your life was wasted because you spent that segment of your life doing the wrong stuff, thinking the wrong way, out of relationship with God and other people, and you created a lot of problems during that period? No need denying it. Yep, she'd had 5 husbands, and the one she was living with now, probably afraid to marry her because he knew from her track record it wasn't going to work out too well. That's not the way Jesus saw it. He said, there's something I want to give you. He said, you've come to this well trying to avoid, trying to hide in shame, and God has so ordered it that you, who were trying to hide, ran smack into the Son of God, of all people. And He wants to change your life. So don't give up too soon. Jesus saw a woman who no longer believed in herself. What kind of faith did she have in God? Probably not a very strong one. She obviously had a very immature understanding of religion and spiritual stuff, how that all works. That comes out in the passage I'm about to read. She knew very little, but what little she did know was enough for Him to work with. And it's the same way with you and anybody in your life who really doesn't know much about the things of God. Maybe it's because you were in church but not paying attention when you really should have been. Or maybe you just never had the opportunity. Maybe you never had the exposure. And Satan will put a little thought in the back of your head, and here's what it goes like. It goes like this. You've lived this long without Christ, without God. I mean, it's been 50, 60 years. You've lived this long. Why change now? It's almost over. Besides, you're too old to change. You've been the way you are so long that if you were to change, man, your old friends wouldn't even recognize you. This is just who you are. Well, Satan always comes to us with half-truths. Half-truths. Because whole truths are so obviously lies. The half-truth. Here's the half-truth. You've been this way so long that if you changed your life, your old friends wouldn't recognize you. That's true. But is that a bad thing? Or is it a good thing? Could it be that the next, maybe even the final chapters of your life could be the chapters where your story really begins to make sense? And the events for a happy ending begin falling into place. Whether it's a novel you're reading, a movie you're watching, or your life, a real person's life. Here's what you often find. Early in a movie, think for a second about the way a movie works, or your favorite sitcom. Early in that program, something bad happens. Some threat emerges, some problem pops up, and the characters in that show spend the rest of the episode wrestling with it, and they usually don't get it whipped. They don't get the problem solved. They don't get a happy ending until the very end. And you need to understand this. If you're only halfway through your show and don't have a happy ending, well, for goodness sake, the show's not over. You got several more commercial breaks to work with. There's more to come. None of us are so far gone that Jesus just turns off the set with us. I know how that's going to turn out. No. Some of the greatest, most important transformation in a human being comes in the end chapters of life. A few weeks ago, when I was with my father at our family reunion in Alabama, we were talking about his father, my grandfather. My father, he knew is not the same one I knew. Let me say that more clearly. When I was a boy, my granddaddy was in his 60s. When my daddy was a boy, his father, my grandfather, was in his 30s and 40s. In his 30s and 40s, my granddaddy Sawyer was a nasty personality to have to live with. Extremely critical tongue. Sarcastic, showed no love to anybody in the family. Rude to his wife, borderline cruel to his two sons. Not spankings, not whippings, more like beatings. And my father grew up that way, and that he went out into life having been raised by that kind of father. Then I came along years later, and this man who'd been such a wretch raising my father had since become a born-again Christian. He had a dream one night. Though he was already in his late 40s, he was actually a deacon in his church. But if you looked at his life, the fruit of the Spirit was not there. You know, the fruit is what you produce. Your fruit, your spiritual fruit, is what comes out of you. It might be sweet, it might be sour. It might be helpful to others or harmful to others. It can be words that snatch other people down, or it can be words that lift people up. That's your fruit. And Jesus said that's the way you spot a true prophet or a false prophet. What is the fruit of his teaching? The people that are listening to him, what kind of people are they becoming? Are they becoming more joyful, more hopeful, more filled with faith? Or are they sour, cynical, with a yeah attitude? By their fruits, you will know them. My granddaddy Sawyer didn't have those fruits. And he had to have known that on some deep level, but he just couldn't admit it to himself. My goodness, he was in his late 40s. He was a deacon. How does a man in that position get up in front of a group of people to be baptized, actually rebaptized, and say, all these years, I really didn't have it. All these years, when you've seen me smiling at church, you should have seen the way I acted as soon as I got in the car with my family. All these years, you've seen me saying prayers before the offering, helping organize a Bible study. All those years you saw that, you were just seeing a tiny bit of me. It was the one part of me that was good. But God knew what was really there. That's a hard thing to admit. What kind of a man, how hard is it to even see that in yourself once you have built your life around this persona that everybody thinks you're this kind of person and you know you're not, something has to happen to let you know that God knows better. And for my grandfather, it happened while he was asleep. See, when we go to sleep, many of you know, our conscious mind, that's the part of our mind that guards, protects, makes sure that we put the best foot forward, that we look good, have our stomach in, and all that. That conscious mind goes to sleep. So the guard is off duty. The guard that constantly protects our image is asleep. And then the truth can come out. My grandfather, in a vision, a dream, he saw himself dangling on a string over hell. As many times as he told me that story late in life, I never knew or heard him say exactly what hell looked like. I'm not sure how much he saw or didn't see, but he knew he was hanging over hell by something very thin and flimsy. And the message he got is, the direction you're heading is not the direction you think you're heading. And it's time to recognize that while there's still time. And my grandfather did recognize it. He woke up, called his pastor. A week later, he was in front of his church, humble like they'd never seen. Maybe the first tear they'd ever seen in his eye. And he said, I tried to be a Christian. It's not that I wasn't trying, but I was not successful. And I wouldn't even admit that I was not successful. I wouldn't even admit that there was anything wrong with what I had. And yet I look. This part he didn't share out loud. This he shared privately later. I look at these boys I've raised and the problems I already see they're going to have because of what I taught them. My grandfather couldn't take that back, but you know what he did? He got saved and he got right with God and he began to grow spiritually so that by the time I came along, he was a different man. And he was in the audience at the very first sermon I ever preached. I was 16 years old. He was already in a wheelchair. And he sat over here on the side and just wept and cried the whole time. And he told me, Lance, I'd rather see you follow the Lord than to be the President of the United States. And that let me know that following the Lord must be pretty important. It's important to my granddaddy. It's important to him. And he sees that it's important for me. It must be important. And I took it seriously. You know what a lot of young people need to see? They need to see a mother or a grandmother, a father or a grandfather who takes it seriously, who understands that our relationship with the Lord is way more important than anything that's happening in Washington, anything that's happening in the Mena news and reviews. It's way more important than what anybody else thinks about you. It's not what others think about you, it's what Christ knows about you. He knows that you are his follower. You and Christ are on a journey. You're going somewhere. And as you travel this journey, from this world right on out into the world to come, with each step, you become a little more like Christ. Because journeying through life, you see, when you're walking with Christ, you don't go far before you realize, hey, this load here that I'm carrying is unnecessary. This load that is so worried what other people think, that's doing nothing but weighing me down. I think I'll drop that. And you go on a little further and you realize that you've got guilt that dominates you. You've got shame and guilt from things way back in the past. You've asked God to forgive you. He did. The only person in the universe that still cares is you, I should say, you and the devil both remember. And if you don't remember it on your own, he'll remind you. Until the point where you realize, the Son has set me free. I'm free indeed. And I'm not going to carry that any longer. And so it is that the further you go in your walk with Christ, the more like him you become, the more free you become, the more you have to share, because the more you've received. That Christ has come to your well. The daily life right here in Mena, Arkansas. He steps in and asks us every now and then, hey, what are you doing? What are you doing? Is this the way you want your life to be? Come on now, it can be so much different. I want you to have a happy ending. Jesus wants to give you that happy ending.